My father stood in front of 50 investors at his company's annual gala, champagne glass raised, and when someone asked him about his son, he laughed and said, "Oh, Daniel? He's basically a janitor. Cleans up after addicts all day." Not exactly what I had in mind when I paid for Stanford, but what can you do? The room went quiet for a second. Then a few people chuckled nervously. I was standing 15 feet away, wearing my best suit, there to support him like I always did. That moment, that specific choice of words in front of people who mattered, people who controlled money and power, that's when something inside me shifted. I looked at my father, this man I'd spent 38 years trying to please, and realized he'd never actually seen me as anything but a disappointment he had to explain away. My name is Daniel Morrison, and this is the story of how my father tried to erase my dignity and how I used everything he taught me about business and leverage to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. Let me take you back 6 months before that gala, because that's when the foundation of everything started cracking. I'd been working as the clinical director at Riverside Recovery Center for 3 years. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Wall Street, it wasn't the corporate law career my father had mapped out for me before I was even born, but it mattered. I worked with people fighting the hardest battle of their lives, people trying to reclaim themselves from addiction, and I was good at it. I had a master's in clinical psychology and addiction counseling. I'd published research. I spoke at conferences. But none of that registered with Richard Morrison, founder and CEO of Morrison Capital Management. To him, if you weren't making 7 figures and wearing Italian shoes, you were nobody. The first real cut came at a family dinner. My sister Caroline was there with her husband, both lawyers at prestigious firms downtown. My younger brother Marcus had just made junior partner at an investment bank. Then there was me. My father asked about my work, and I made the mistake of being honest. I told him about a success story, a young man who'd been through our program twice, finally hit 2 years sober, reunited with his kids. I was proud of that. My father listened with this expression I'd seen 1,000 times, like he was calculating something disappointing. Then he said, "That's very noble, Daniel, but when are you going to do something that actually builds wealth? You're almost 40. You should own property. You should have a portfolio. Instead, you're essentially doing social work." My mother touched his arm gently, trying to soften it, but the damage was done. Caroline looked uncomfortable. Marcus just stared at his plate. That's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with, or more accurately, what I was capable of when pushed far enough. I let it go that night. I'd spent a lifetime letting things go with my father, but something was building inside me, a quiet calculation. The same analytical mind he'd always dismissed was starting to work on a problem he didn't know he created. See, my father had this blind spot. He assumed that because I'd chosen a different path, I'd somehow lost all the skills and knowledge he'd drilled into me growing up. He'd made me study financial statements at the dinner table when I was 12. He taught me about leverage, about due diligence, about finding weaknesses in any deal. He trained me to think like him, then acted shocked when I chose to think for myself instead. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was forgetting that I still had access to things: family trust documents, business incorporation papers, investor agreements. My mother, God bless her, had always kept me on certain accounts in distributions, partly because she loved me, partly because she'd always worried about my father's impulsive decisions. She never said it directly, but I knew she wanted someone outside Richard's inner circle to have oversight. That someone was me. The real breaking point came 3 weeks after that family dinner. My father's company was hosting a networking event, and he'd invited me, probably to show I existed, to prove he had 3 successful children instead of just 2. I went because my mother asked me to, because she said it would mean something to her. I should have known better. The event was at this beautiful rooftop venue downtown, the kind of place where a single cocktail costs $40 and everyone's calculating net worth while pretending to care about your stories. I was talking with a potential donor for our recovery center, a woman who'd lost her brother to addiction and wanted to fund treatment beds. It was a good conversation, meaningful. And then my father appeared with 2 of his biggest investors. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the limits of his cruelty. He interrupted us mid-sentence, put his hand on my shoulder with this practiced smile, and said to the investors, "Gentlemen, this is my oldest son, Daniel. He works at a rehab facility, basically keeps the place running, maintenance, that sort of thing." He literally describes my work as maintenance, as if I mopped floors and fixed toilets. The woman I'd been talking to looked confused because we'd just been discussing clinical program design and evidence-based treatment modalities. One of the investors, trying to be polite, asked what my role was, and before I could answer, my father jumped in again. He's very hands-on with the clients, very compassionate work. Not for everyone, but Daniel's always had a soft heart, not much of a head for business, but a good heart. Then he steered them away, leaving me standing there with this woman who now looked at me with pity instead of professional respect. I excused myself, went to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been hot, immediate, messy. What I felt was cold and clear, like a switch had flipped, like I'd been playing a game with one set of rules and suddenly realized I'd been a fool for not playing to win. My father wanted to reduce me to nothing in front of people who controlled resources and reputation. Fine, I'd show him exactly what nothing felt like. If you're watching this right now, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is where this story really begins. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for the mental grand, because the revenge I planned took months of patience, and you need to hear every single move. I started doing research that night, real research. I went home and opened up every file my mother had ever shared with me about the family trusts, the business structure, everything. Morrison Capital Management was impressive on the surface: 42 employees, $200 million in assets under management, offices in 3 cities. My father was the face of it all, the founder, the visionary. But when you dug into the actual ownership structure, things got interesting. The company wasn't entirely his. It had been capitalized initially through a family trust established by my grandfather, my father's father, who died 12 years ago. That trust had specific terms. It distributed income to my father as CEO, but the actual ownership shares were divided among the beneficiaries, which included me, my siblings, and my mother. Here's where it got fascinating. My father had operational control because he was named as the trust executor and the company's CEO, but he didn't have unilateral ownership. He'd been operating for years as if he owned everything outright, making decisions, taking distributions, even using company assets for personal investments. But technically, legally, any major decision about the company's direction or structure required approval from the trust's advisory board, which, per my grandfather's wishes, consisted of 3 people: my father, my mother, and the eldest grandchild when they turned 35. That eldest grandchild was me. I'd turned 38 2 months before that gala. I'd been on the advisory board for 3 years, and never once had my father convened a meeting or asked for my input on anything. Why would he? To him, I was the janitor's son who didn't understand business. That was his third mistake, and the one that would cost him everything. I spent 2 weeks reviewing every document. I consulted with a friend from college who'd become a corporate attorney, very quietly, hypothetically, and I learned about fiduciary duty, about what happens when a trust executor makes decisions without proper advisory board consultation, about how distributions could be challenged if they weren't properly authorized. Then I started looking at the specific decisions my father had made over the past 5 years. There were some concerning patterns. He'd moved company assets into personal investment vehicles. He'd taken distributions that seemed excessive compared to company performance. He'd made promises to investors about returns that didn't match the actual fund performance. Nothing criminally fraudulent, but definitely sloppy, definitely questionable, and definitely done without the oversight the trust legally required. The more I dug, the more I realized my father had been treating this company like his personal empire, forgetting it was built on my grandfather's money and still legally bound by my grandfather's rules. And my grandfather, for all his own flaws, had been meticulous about proper structure and accountability. He'd set up the trust specifically to prevent any one person from running things into the ground through ego or carelessness. He'd probably known his son well enough to build in those protections. I never appreciated my grandfather's foresight until that moment, sitting in my small apartment at midnight, surrounded by financial documents, realizing I held more power than my father had ever imagined. But here's the thing. I didn't want to destroy him, not at first. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to understand what he'd done and apologize. I wanted basic human respect. So I tried the reasonable approach first. That decision almost cost me everything, because what came next showed me just how far my father would go to maintain his narrative. I called him and asked for a meeting, professional, calm, respectful. I said I wanted to discuss some trust matters and my role on the advisory board. He sounded confused, like he'd forgotten that board existed, but he agreed. We met at his office the following Tuesday. It was the first time I'd been there in probably 2 years. The place was all glass and chrome, commanding views of the city, expensive art on the walls. His assistant brought us coffee in cups that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I sat across from him at his massive desk and tried to have an adult conversation about governance and oversight and fiduciary responsibility. He listened for maybe 5 minutes, then cut me off with this patronizing smile. Daniel, I appreciate you taking an interest in the family business, but this is complicated stuff. You've been focused on your rehab work, which is fine, but running a capital management firm requires a certain level of financial sophistication. Your grandfather set up that advisory board as a formality, but nobody expects you to actually involve yourself in operations. You don't have the background for it. I remember feeling my jaw tighten. I said, very carefully, that I'd reviewed the trust documents with an attorney and that actually major decisions did require board approval, and that hadn't been happening. He waved his hand dismissively. You talked to an attorney? About family business? Jesus, Daniel, what's gotten into you? Are you having money problems? Is that what this is about? Do you need a loan? He'd turned my legitimate legal concern into a story about me being desperate and incompetent. That's what he did. That's what he'd always done. Rewrite reality so he was always the hero and everyone else was always falling short. I stood up. I told him I expected to be consulted on future major decisions as the trust required. He said, sure, absolutely, of course, with the tone of someone humoring a child. I knew he'd forget about it the moment I left, and I was right. 2 weeks later, I found out through Marcus that my father had just finalized a deal to acquire a smaller investment firm, a decision that required significant company resources and definitely qualified as a major structural decision. He hadn't said a word to me or convened any board meeting. He'd simply done it, then announced it as a victory to the family. When I called him on it, he got angry. He told me I was being ridiculous, that I needed to stop playing lawyer and focus on my own career, and that if I had a problem with how he ran the company my grandfather built, maybe I didn't deserve to benefit from the trust at all. That threat was the final straw. The moment he suggested I didn't deserve my grandfather's legacy because I dared to question him, that's when I stopped playing defense and went on offense. I spent the next month building an airtight case. I documented every major decision he'd made without board approval. I analyzed the company's finances and found multiple instances of questionable distributions. I discovered he'd been paying himself a management fee that wasn't clearly authorized under the trust terms. I found emails where he'd made promises to investors that contradicted the fund's actual strategy. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report, 68 pages, and I had it reviewed by not one, but 3 different attorneys who specialized in trust law and corporate governance. They all said the same thing. I had grounds to petition for his removal as executor and CEO based on breach of fiduciary duty and failure to follow trust governance requirements. But I didn't file anything yet, because the gala was coming up, and I had a feeling my father would give me one more public humiliation, one more reason to make sure I followed through. And boy, did he deliver. The night of the gala, I arrived early. I wore my best suit, the one I'd bought for speaking engagements at addiction medicine conferences. I helped my mother with seating arrangements. I was kind to my father's employees and polite to his investors. I was everything a good son should be. And then came the moment I described at the beginning, when someone asked about me, and my father called me a janitor who cleaned up after addicts. He said it wasn't a real career. He said it with a smile, like it was a charming family joke, instead of a calculated dismissal of everything I'd built. I didn't react. I smiled. I nodded. I even laughed a little, like I was in on the joke. But inside, that cold clarity I'd felt weeks earlier crystallized into absolute certainty. My father had been given every chance to see me as a person, to treat me with basic respect, and he'd chosen cruelty instead. So I would choose consequences. The next morning, I filed a formal petition with the court overseeing the trust. I requested an emergency hearing based on ongoing breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized distributions, and failure to follow mandatory governance procedures. I submitted my 68-page report as evidence. I also did something my attorneys had suggested. I filed a motion to freeze all major transactions and distributions pending the hearing. It was a nuclear option, but given the pattern of unauthorized decisions, the judge granted it. 48 hours after my father called me a janitor in front of his investors, his company's bank accounts were frozen. He couldn't move money, couldn't make distributions, couldn't finalize any pending deals. Everything stopped. I'll never forget the phone call. My father screaming, absolutely incoherent with rage, demanding to know what I'd done, calling me ungrateful, calling me vindictive, saying I was trying to destroy him. I let him yell until he ran out of steam. Then I said very calmly, "You called me a janitor. You reduced 3 years of graduate school, a decade of professional work, and actual human lives I've helped save to a punchline for your investor friends. You did that in public, knowing it would humiliate me because you can't stand that I chose a life you don't understand. So now you're going to learn what it feels like when someone with power doesn't see you as fully human." He tried to threaten me. He tried to guilt me. He even tried to bribe me, offering me to put me on the company payroll with some made-up executive title. I declined everything. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out, and during that time, his company was essentially paralyzed. Investors started asking questions. Deals fell through. Employees worried about payroll. The local business press got wind of internal family legal issues and started sniffing around. My father's perfect image, the empire he'd built on my grandfather's foundation while pretending he'd done it alone, started cracking in very public ways. My mother called me, crying, not angry, just sad. She said she understood why I'd done it, but asked if there was any way to fix things without destroying the family. I told her the truth. I didn't want to destroy anything. I wanted accountability. I wanted my father to admit he'd been wrong, to treat me with respect, and to actually follow the legal structure my grandfather had wisely put in place. She said she'd talk to him. I said, good luck, because his ego had never allowed for actual apology or accountability in his entire life. Here's what you need to understand about revenge, real revenge, the kind that actually means something. It's not about causing pain. It's about revealing truth. I wasn't attacking my father. I was simply holding him to the same standards he'd held everyone else to for decades, the standards he'd drilled into me about contracts and obligations and following the rules. He'd built his entire career on the idea that agreements mattered, that structure mattered, that you couldn't just do whatever you felt like because you thought you were smarter than everyone else. And then he'd violated every single one of those principles because he assumed nobody was watching or had the spine to challenge him. The hearing was fascinating. My father showed up with 2 attorneys and this attitude of wounded dignity, like he was the victim of an ungrateful son's baseless attack. I showed up with my 3 attorneys and 68 pages of documented evidence. The judge was a woman in her 60s who'd spent 30 years in trust and estate law. She did not suffer fools. She listened to my father's attorneys argue that this was a family dispute that should be handled privately, that freezing the accounts was causing undue harm, that my father had always acted in good faith. Then she looked at my evidence. She spent 2 hours reviewing documents while we all sat there in silence. Then she looked at my father and asked him directly, "Mr. Morrison, Did you or did you not make multiple major structural and financial decisions without convening the advisory board required under the trust governance documents? He tried to explain that it was standard practice, that the board was a formality, that he'd built the company. She cut him off. That's not what I asked. Did you or did you not follow a governance procedures required by the trust? He had no good answer, because the answer was no, he hadn't, and we all knew it. The judge didn't remove him as CEO that day, but she did several things that fundamentally shifted the power dynamic. She ordered that all future major decisions required documented advisory board approval with at least 2 of the 3 board members in agreement. She appointed an independent monitor to review all company transactions and distributions for the next 2 years. She required my father to repay approximately $200,000 in questionable personal distributions he'd taken without proper authorization, and she made it clear that any further violations would result in his immediate removal as executor and CEO, with management transitioning to a professional third party or potentially to other family members. In other words, she put him on probation in his own company and gave me and my mother actual enforcement power. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years during that hearing. When we walked out, he wouldn't even look at me. But my mother did. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your grandfather would be proud." That meant more than any apology my father could have given, because I knew it was true. My grandfather had set up those protections specifically for moments like this. He'd known his son's weaknesses and had tried to build in accountability. I'd just finally had the courage to enforce what was always supposed to be there. The fallout took months to fully play out. My father had to send letters to all his investors explaining the governance changes and the oversight requirements. Several investors actually appreciated it, seeing it as a sign of maturity and proper structure, rather than the family chaos my father feared they'd perceive. Some of his employees quietly reached out to me, thanking me, saying they'd been worried about his impulsive decisions but had no power to question him. The company didn't collapse. In fact, with proper oversight and less erratic decision-making, it stabilized. My father's ego took the real hit, which was exactly what needed to happen. But here's the part that actually changed everything, the moment that made all of this about something bigger than revenge. 3 months after the hearing, my father showed up in my workplace. Not my apartment, not neutral ground, but Riverside Recovery Center, the place he'd dismissed and mocked. He asked to speak with me privately. We went to my office, this small room with inspirational posters and client success stories on the walls, nothing like his glass tower downtown. He sat down and looked around, really looked like he was seeing it for the first time. Then he said something I'd never expected to hear. "I didn't understand what you did here. I thought I did, but I didn't." Turns out, one of his investors, a man he'd known for 20 years, had a son who'd overdosed 2 weeks after my father called me a janitor at the gala. The investor had reached out to my father in grief, asking if he knew any good treatment programs. My father, probably feeling guilty, had mentioned me. The investor had called me directly, and I'd helped get his son into our program immediately. The young man was now 6 weeks sober and rebuilding his life. The investor had called my father the day before to thank him, telling him his son was alive because of the program, because of the clinical director who'd personally made sure he got the right level of care. He'd described me as brilliant, compassionate, and the reason his family still had hope. My father had realized, finally, that the investor was talking about the son he'd called a janitor. My father didn't quite apologize that day in my office. Men like him don't apologize easily. But he said, "I was wrong about what you do. I don't understand it, but I was wrong to dismiss it, and I was wrong to talk about you that way at the gala. It was cruel, and you didn't deserve it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough to start with." Over the following months, things shifted. My father started asking me about my work, actually listening when I answered. He made a donation to our recovery center, a significant one, not for tax purposes, but because he'd started to understand why it mattered. He followed the governance procedures without complaint, even seemed relieved sometimes to have oversight and accountability. He introduced me at family events as my son, Daniel, who runs a recovery center and saves lives, and he said it with something that almost looked like pride. We weren't close, probably never would be, but we were civil, we were respectful, and that was more than I'd had before. The company continued operating under the new structure. I attended quarterly board meetings, reviewed major decisions, asked questions when things didn't make sense. My father occasionally got frustrated with the process, but he followed it. The independent monitor's reports showed no further violations. My mother seemed lighter, less stressed, like she'd been carrying the weight of managing my father's ego for decades and was grateful someone else finally shared that load. My siblings adjusted to the new reality. Caroline admitted she'd been horrified by what he'd said at the gala, but hadn't known how to address it. Marcus confessed he'd always resented how our father treated my career choices, but had been too conflict-averse to speak up. We all started being more honest with each other, which was uncomfortable, but also healthier. As for me, I kept doing my work. I kept running programs at Riverside, kept helping people find their way back from the darkest places humans can go, kept publishing research and speaking at conferences. But I also finally let myself feel proud of what I'd built, instead of constantly defending it against my father's judgments. I bought a house, small but mine, with money from trust distributions I was now properly entitled to and no longer felt guilty accepting. I started dating someone I'd met at a conference, a woman who understood the work and valued it. I built a life that was genuinely mine, not defined by my father's approval or disapproval, but by my own values and choices. The biggest change was internal. I stopped carrying this weight of trying to prove something to a man who'd never been able to see me clearly. The revenge wasn't really about freezing his accounts or challenging his authority in court. That was just the mechanism. The real victory was reclaiming my own dignity and forcing him to confront the consequences of his cruelty. The real victory was realizing I didn't need his validation to know my life mattered. Every person who walked out of our program sober was proof. Every family reunited was proof. Every life saved was proof. My father's opinion, in the end, was just one opinion, and not even an informed one. There's this moment that stayed with me about 6 months after everything settled. I was at another family dinner, and my father mentioned a business challenge he was facing with a difficult investor. He was getting frustrated, going in circles, and my mother gently suggested he might want to ask for my perspective. He looked at her, then at me, and you could see him wrestling with it, his ego versus his actual respect for my analytical skills. Finally, he laid out the situation and asked what I thought. I listened, thought about it, and gave him a strategy based on negotiation principles I'd learned from mediating family conflicts in addiction recovery. It worked. The investor situation resolved. My father called me a week later just to thank me and to say that sometimes the skills that matter don't come from business school. That phone call, that acknowledgement that I had value he couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet, that might have been the real ending to this story. Not perfect reconciliation, not a Hollywood moment where everything's forgotten, but real growth, real change, real respect earned through boundaries and consequences, and refusing to accept less than I deserved. If you've stayed with me this far in this story here on The Mental Grand, thank you, because this isn't really just my story. It's the story of everyone who's been dismissed by someone who should have valued their value. It's the story of what happens when you stop asking for permission to matter and start demanding the respect you're entitled to. It's the story of how sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's forcing people to see the truth they've been avoiding. My father called me a janitor because my rehab work wasn't a real career in his eyes, so I froze his funding and forced him to see me as a person with power, intelligence, and rights he'd been violating for years. It wasn't about hurting him, it was about refusing to be hurt anymore without consequence. It was saying, I matter, my work matters, and you will treat me accordingly or face the reality of the legal structure you've been ignoring. Sometimes the people who need the hardest lessons are the ones closest to us. Sometimes the revenge that heals is the revenge that enforces basic human respect. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in tearing someone down, but in building yourself up so high they can't ignore you anymore. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have valued you, I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me about a time you had to stand up for yourself against someone who underestimated you. Subscribe to The Mental Grand because we tell stories here about people who refused to stay silent, who demanded justice, who chose dignity over approval. We share stories of quiet strength, strategic revenge, and the power of knowing your worth, even when others don't. Your value isn't determined by other people's limited vision. Your career, your choices, your life's work matters because you say it does, because it has meaning to you and the people you serve. Don't let anyone, not even family, especially not family, reduce you to their small understanding of what success looks like. Stand tall, know your worth, and when necessary, enforce it with every legal, ethical tool you have available. That's not cruelty, that's justice, that's dignity. That's the message of The Mental Grand, and that's the message I hope you carry with you from my story.